Hey there, everybody. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Lailani, and this is how we grow is this podcast. Every Sunday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we get the opportunity to sit with authors, influencers, and elders within the spiritual community who get to speak to us about the wonderful things that they are writing about, things that they are engaging in, and things that they are doing for the community. And tonight I have a very special guest that I'm really excited to talk about. His name is David Shi, and he is the author of Spirit Voices, The Mysteries and Magic of North Asian Shamanism. Listen, you guys, I know every time I come up here, I'm always like, you got to get this book. You got to get this book. And that's mainly because I'm a really good scout of amazing information and authors. But it's also because these books are really truly, you just have to get them, and this is no different. This book needs to be on your bookshelf. The reason why is because there are so many misconceptions that so many of us have about this term shamanism and its history and its roots and its tools and its practices and its people. Let's not forget its people. And this book breaks it all down for you and some. Okay, so when I say you need this book, I said what I said. Now, before we bring David Shi on, let's get to know him a little bit. He is a shamanic worker and folk magic practitioner who primarily engages in traditional North Asian forms of shamanism. He is primarily of Manchurian descent, but can also trace his ancestry to Mongolian, Chinese, Korean, as well as a little Tungus Siberian and ancient Central Asian Turkic heritage as well. Raised in a household that incorporated both Southeast Siberian and North Chinese practices, David has dedicated his spare time to the study of the spiritual traditions of his ancestors and of Greater Eurasia. Recognized as a sagaasha, I'm going to tear this word up, but David, please don't hate me. Ongodtengertei. I hope I got that. A future shaman prior to initiation among both Mongolian and Korean shamans, David's practices are deeply rooted in spirit work in which ancestral and land spirits are called to empower all working. David is also the author of this amazing book right here that we are going to talk about tonight, Spirit Voices, The Mystery and Magic of North Asian Shamanism. And David also teaches the Korean traditional drumming art of Pung Mul and Samulnori. Again, don't hate me for that. David currently resides in Manhattan, New York, where he occasionally provides spiritual services, products, and workshops to his immediate communities. And he is doing so much work in educating his fellow Asian Americans to connect to their spiritual roots. And of course, you can find him on Instagram at DavidShi311. Let's bring this amazing person on. Hey.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going great. And I'm so excited that you're here. And I am so grateful that you said yes to come on this show. Thank you so much.
No worries. Just a quick thing. The Instagram is David J Shi 311.
Let's write it.
Yeah. It's DavidJShi 311.
It is now in the comments section, and you will also find it below in the description. Make sure you give him a follow. David, let's talk about this amazing book.
Sure.
We need to talk about this book. You did an amazing job with it. I was a thoroughly enjoyable read on top of informative. And as I mentioned to you in our pre-interview, it's also a very dense subject. You know, you were able to cram in a lot of information in a very digestible way. And I'm shooketh is the word, right? So let's break it down, because here's the thing. And I know you know this because you wrote a book on it, but we've been in this game for quite a while. And I don't know about you, but I've been in the pagan community just overall for a really long time, like since the 90s. And I remember how the word shaman was used within the pagan community. It never quite sat right with me. But of course, that was not my tradition, and I did not have the right to speak on it. So I'm going to ask you tonight, this word shaman is a very loaded word. It is used very much interchangeably with just any sort of practice that involves drumming, some smoke, some animals, and some spirit journeying with mushrooms, right? And I feel like we need to kind of clear that up. So why don't you, from your history and from your truth, what is shamanism? What's the history behind this?
Sure. And I guess one thing I want to first address is pretty much where everyone sees the word first. Pretty much any resource out there that even uses the word shaman, in the first chapter, first page, they will say that the word comes from Siberia, from the Evenk people or the Tungus people of Siberia. And that's where that conversation ends. And then
right.
So my attempt at this book was like, wait, what else?
Right.
So basically, that's pretty much the one thing that every resource gets right. It's the word was taken from that specific culture, and we do have a very specific definition for that word. Basically, just to jump right into it, we would define a shaman as a person who was chosen by shamanic ancestral spirits when they are born to serve as essentially a bridge between the human world and the spirit worlds, in which condition they go into controlled, deliberate, and repeatable trance states in which they do two things, or they can do two things. One is trance possession, essentially, and the other is spirit flight, which is probably what most people associate with shamanic journey. It's when, and in both cases, during trance possession, it's that specific shamanic ancestral spirit that chose you that comes to possess you. And when you conduct spirit flight, that specific spirit or spirits are the ones that escorts your soul into the spirit world. And I do want to quickly emphasize the difference between that and shamanic journeying is, from what I've seen people in the West when they do journey work, it's mostly to find answers or find insights, which is traditionally never the reason why we do that. We, if anything, we feel like our divination systems and our transpossession systems are pretty good in handling that. When we do go into the spirit world, it's actually we actually prefer not to do it because we see it as very risky. When we do it, it's because we don't have any other option but to do that, which oftentimes means engaging with spirits in their own turf, oftentimes hostile spirits. So that could mean, bribing, tricking, fighting.
Yes.
So which is why I will quick comment when people say they do, shamanic journeys. I always have to remind myself that they're only going just far enough to get insights and answers and not any further than that, because that would entail really dangerous territory. But anyways, before I go into too much of a tangent, I do want to say that is probably the definition I gave is probably one of the best definitions that I've seen as described in the English language. The reason why the word is so popularly used around the world is, in short, because of colonial history. When the Russians and the Dutch were the first ones to encounter Siberian peoples of any kind, they learned this word shaman, brought it over to Europe. At the time, they used it to pretty much describe any indigenous tradition within, North Asia, Siberia, Central Asia, which is still kind of correct. But the word, quickly spread to France, which was Russia's ally, and then to Spain and the UK, which controlled obviously the large colonial empires that they did. Right. The thing is, when these people colonized much of the world, they didn't want to use a word that described like holiness or something of a holy nature, because that would essentially equate these tribal peoples to the same level as Christian priests. So they were looking for any other word that they could use. And the one word they already knew that described a not Christian or not Abrahamic belief systems elders was the word shaman. That was the only word they knew. So that's why they used that word pretty much in everywhere that they traveled around the world. And that's why that word is so popularly known today. A lot of people in the US, for example, they describe Native American beliefs as shamanism, which Native people, oftentimes Native elders, not necessarily Native young people, but Native elders will be the first to tell you that they don't know the word. It doesn't exist in their language. They don't know where it came from. It's just what other people call them.
Right.
Because it is frankly, because it is not their word. And even when those who do study a little bit about what the word actually comes from, there's actually very, very few traditions in the Americas that actually could use the word shaman as applied to in the way that we use it. From our observations, the native tribes that we would consider to be most similar to us in terms of shamanic practice would actually be the Inuits and the tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And then there's pockets, like there are pockets in West Amazon that develop something organically that we would consider to be similar, and there's another tribe in Central America. But most of the tribes of the Native Americans, their spirituality is something that is technically not shamanic in the sense that we would apply that word. And one thing I do want to quickly say, and we talked about this in our pre-interview conversation, is that when I describe a tradition as not being shamanic, that does not mean that they are not legitimate or not powerful or not authentic. It just simply means that it's not that
word.
Yeah. It's just
that's it.
The best way I can describe it is an orange is not a grapefruit. They are both citrus fruits, but they are not the same. It's just maybe it's just technicality. But a big thing about the word shaman is the fact that it implies someone, from my definition, someone who was chosen by the spirits at birth. Now, cultures and spiritualities and traditions all around the world, they do incorporate transpossession or some form of spirit flight. But the big condition is that they were chosen by specific spirits when they are born. Right. And so the thing with being a shaman is that although everyone can learn shamanic techniques, it's impossible to learn to be a shaman because you are born one. And if you are born one and you're chosen one, you have no choice but to follow this path, or else the spirits will punish you. And sometimes even, in some cases, might even kill the person who keeps trying to reject that calling. And I apologize for going on a tangent, but there's one more thing that I love it. Do it. There's one more thing I want to say is, because the North Asian and Himalayan and Central Asian and a couple other cultures, they've been working with their traditions developed around the concept of a shaman for thousands of years in such an unbroken way. Their traditions are arguably the only ones that we can call shamanic traditions. And other cultures around the world, even though their traditions are not shamanic traditions, I would argue that it is still possible that shamans could emerge within non-shamanic traditions, if that makes sense. Let me give you an example. I have seen, whether it's in I think it was a documentary about some of the indigenous religions in West Africa, and from what I have observed and what I've heard from people who are of that traditions, people who want to initiate and become priests and priestesses, it is largely for many people, it's a personal choice that they choose to dedicate their life to that. But every now and then, there is an individual who comes along who they have to do it. They have no choice. And if they don't do it, the spirits will kill them. And in such a case, that person is quite possibly a shaman from within our tradition. Their tradition as a whole, because for most other people, if they don't want to do it, they don't have to. That's and so in that sense, that tradition is not shamanic, but there are individual cases where shamans have popped up. And we would say that from our perspective and our standpoint, it's because something happened within their ancestral lineage, in which case, especially happens for families where there has been continuous spiritual practice or a long history of spiritual practice, where you get those crotchety curmudgeon old ancestors who are like, no, my descendant must do this, and if gosh darn it if they don't, because I will beat them if they don't. and so and then if something like that happens on multiple levels, on the spiritual level with your ancestors, then lo and behold, that's essentially how a shaman comes about. So here's me trying to get the sexiness out of the word shaman, because it is not, because it is what it comes down to is that's pretty much what it is. It's you spend your life in service dedicated to the spirits. You don't have that much sovereignty. It's not a coincidence that in many of these North Asian traditional cultures, being identified as a shaman is oftentimes seen as a curse by that family, because they're like, oh, I did not want my children or grandchildren to have this life. I did not want them to, it's because it's basically their life is not their own anymore. It's completely in dedication to, pretty much. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Bro, I know what you mean. So in the Spanish culture, in the Latin culture, we have similar ideas coming through. So like things like a child being born in their sack still, or a child being born with the umbilical cord around their neck. Usually when a child is born in some kind of distress, or loses consciousness, or turns blue, or has like an issue at the moment of birth, there's usually a myth or a rumor around them that they are special in some kind of way, in some spiritual way. And especially if they died and somehow managed to come back, that's an even like bigger thing. So I totally get that, but it's interesting how, when you're talking about not sexifying this word, it's so true, because we tend to romanticize these practices to the point where it's a little dangerous the way we talk about it. It's a little what's the right word? Irresponsible. Oh,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Because, you see so many people that will say, I have the calling, or this experience happened to me, and so now I want to follow this path. But it's like, do you not realize how dangerous and how much work and how much, and you spoke about specifically in your book, you kind of went into a little bit about little shaman versus big shaman. And I loved the way you kind of coined that, because it's true. Like, there are levels to this, everyone has these innate sort of intuitive abilities and, those gut feelings and those things. And some people are even really, really adept at doing tarot and divination and all that. And you can have some of these layers, but that doesn't put you at the level where you can go around fucking with spirits. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that's where people tend to not realize where the line is. They want to push that line and push that line. So I'm really glad you're talking about this and really taking sort of the romanticism out and showing something for what it is and how it needs to be respected and taken seriously. So when you say we define this and we coined this, who are we talking about? Because in your book, you had 3 different types of shamanisms that you were talking about, Turkic, Mongolic. So is that what you mean by the we, or do you mean it by Siberian definition only?
So the reason, I use the term North Asia, even though it's not, there's a broad definition, but what the way that I define it is actually these 3 core umbrella cultures: the Turkic, the Mongolic, and the Tungusic. Because these 3 cultures, or these 3 groups of cultures, they're very much neighbors to each other, and they share a lot of very similar cosmology. They do have very different regional practices and different cultural practices as well. But from these 3 cultures, we do often see each other as, sister or cousin tribes, because we all have a very, very similar role of the shaman, and we all have a very similar cosmology and foundation. We actually pretty much all believe that all of our shamans used to descend from the same people. And in my first chapter, I actually come up with a linguistic reason of why that is. So a lot of people don't know the word shaman is technically, within the Tungusic Siberian peoples, it is a male word. It is the word for a male shaman, and the reason why that word became popular is because those same, explorers from Russia and Netherlands, they only talked to the men. They didn't talk to the women.
Of
Yeah,
course.
so they only learned the word for a male shaman. Across all of these peoples, the Turkic, the Mongolic, the Tungusic peoples, the word for a male shaman is vastly different. It's completely different. But almost all of them have the same or extremely similar words for a female shaman. It's almost always utkan or utagan or utken or itkan. They all sound very, very similar. It's just maybe a slight vowel difference, but they all are so extremely similar. And
Wow.
so it's generally agreed that because they are so similar, they probably came from the same source. I mean, it also tells us that female shamans are much older than male shamans. Male shamans came about actually later in history, but because these female shamans all have the same words, and it makes complete sense that it then spread, and as these individual cultures kind of went their own separate ways, when male shamans came about, they came up with their own words for the male shaman, but the word for a female shaman pretty much stayed the same.
Unified. Wow.
Yeah. And I always love when academic sources, because the academic sources that do talk about this, they say, oh, the male shamans came about because they copied the female shamans. And I'm here going like, do you really don't think those female shamans had kids?
Yeah, right?
Is it that hard to believe that they had kids and the spirits then went down the family line? You know?
I think, it's so amazing how Christianity and patriarchy, how that field of vision just hones in on everything, because in those cultures and in that spirituality, you have to be celibate, and you have to be you can't have children, and you're a holy person, and it's like this whole thing, and it's like, no, not in our traditions.
No, if anything, having kids is actually what passes the lineage down.
Exactly. So can I ask you, so I come from a very magical background with my practice, and I've always had a respect for this idea of shamanism, but I always saw it much more as a ritualistic communion, ancestral, spiritual thing versus conjuring up this and mixing these potions and saying these incantations and spells. But in your book, there's some crossover there. So I have to ask, is there this concept of magic, and if so, are there types of magic that these shamans engage in? Is there good magic, bad magic, or do you have a whole different sort of terminology for it altogether?
This is a very complicated question.
Because
yeah, I mean, is there magic? I mean, the blunt answer is yes. The way that we see it is that for the people who are shamans, their power does not come from themselves. It comes from their spirits and the strength of their spirits to be able to perform based off of the knowledge that they have from the lineage of past generations. And so and the spirits can do all sorts of miracles. It's depending on how strong they are. They can perform all sorts of miracles or magical work within the physical world. It's not, the different types are not so defined as they are in Western traditions, in terms of they do. It's broadly like just blessings, cleansings, cursing, and the way they do have a concept of black shamanism and white shamanism and yellow shamanism, and it has nothing.
I saw that.
Yeah. It has nothing to do with whether it's harmful or not. It's actually defined in terms of risk. So what we would define as black shamanism is actually a tradition of shamanism that oftentimes deals with spirits and energies that are more wrathful. And it can be wrathful in a harmful way or wrathful in a good way. But because it is wrathful, there is a degree of risk. And oftentimes, and then what happened is that these black shamans, they were obviously employed for wars or also diplomacy. So they got a little bit more political. But within black shamanism, or within whether a working is considered more black is judged by how much potential risk there is in performing it. And that actually does include cleansings and healings,
Mm.
because when you cleanse or heal someone, you're putting yourself in contact with potentially harmful energies. And you could actually get, like contagion, basically. It could be like contagious to you. So in that sense, we would call black. What we would call white is basically, blessings, or, it's anything that, or like, it's basically anything that's, attraction or blessing, or basically anything that doesn't deal with potentially harmful workings or energies.
Gotcha.
And then we also have something called yellow shamanism, which is basically the type of shamanism in North Asia that has experienced high degrees of influence from Buddhism. And then we just it's a very broad classification, because within the Buddhist influence,
I was gonna say, and with Buddhism is its own umbrella term too. It's like, what?
Yeah,
That's
so
wild.
it does get very, very complicated. One thing that they often talk about within some of the lineages that are especially powerful in their cursing is that their ability to do hypnosis and their ability to influence and be able to. They actually say that in within their traditions, the most powerful magical tools that you could have are your eyes and your tongue, because your eyes, even non shamans who have spiritual talent or magic that can do magical works, they have the ability to just use their eyes to hypnotize people and compel them to do certain things. And they say the tongue, because the tongue in itself can be used to bless or curse people. We actually say if someone, there's a funny expression for anyone who is the type that constantly gossips about other people or talks smack about other people. We actually say that they have a black tongue, because they always use their tongue to to mutter bad things about other people. So we actually consider sort of gossip to actually be spiritually potent. So we also are very careful about like
it's
gossiping.
like your version, it's like your version of like the evil eye and stuff
in a
like
sense,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Now I have a question with regards to how one is chosen to be a shaman and how one comes into being a shaman. But before I ask that question, we had a little bit of a discussion about that you're born into this, and in our tradition specifically, especially if you're coming in with a trauma, there's something special about you. There's a question here in the chat though, is asking that in some traditions LGBTQ individuals are considered sacred and spiritual elders. Is that something that also exists in shamanism as well? Like, do you guys have something or a special place for your LGBT?
It can. I can't say definitively that it is or is not. I can only say that it can, only because oftentimes people who are chosen by the spirits, let me say it this way, it's not a matter of being LGBT in itself makes you more likely to be chosen by spirits or have spiritual talent. It's having that spiritual talent or being chosen by the spirits when you are born then does something to you that then could make you LGBT. So the way that I would describe this is that it's not uncommon for shamans to be LGBT. Actually, within North Siberia, which is a little bit farther from the traditions I practice, it's not exactly transgender, but a gender fluidity is much more common, because it ultimately depends on your spirits. And if your spirits literally say, "Oh, you're not the gender you're supposed to be, you need to transition," so that can happen. Because oftentimes our main shamanic spirit is actually a spirit that's not the same gender as you. It's just it's not a written rule. It just tends to happen that way.
Right.
So, for example,
For that balancing purpose.
in a way, yes. Like even
Those
my
energies.
main shamanic spirit is actually a grandmother ancestral. We call it grandmother spirit.
Yeah.
But so yeah, it does tend to happen. There is, I think, on average, more LGBT people, or there's a higher percentage of LGBT people within spiritual practices within North Asia as well. But I do need to caveat, because it is possible for ancestral spirits to be homophobic as well.
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So, and oftentimes, and not oftentimes, sometimes these are shamanic ancestral spirits. The ancestral shamanic spirit that chose you was homophobic. They were homophobic in life, and they're homophobic as a shamanic ancestral spirit. In which case, if the shaman is LGBT, their life can be very difficult. So,
right.
so I do want to add that that caveat.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that honestly, that sits well,
Yeah.
because, you know, whenever I talk about spirits of the dead, because I do a lot of classes with regards to spirits who have passed and ancestral and all that stuff, I always tell people, I'm like, look, just because you died doesn't mean all your sins and who you were as a person just magically disappears. If you were an asshole in life, most likely you're going to be an asshole when you die, regardless of, you know, your attributes and your job and your career and your wife. It doesn't matter. Like, and so that definitely fits. And there's also some traditions too that I've heard, and I don't know how, you know, I have no idea where the evidence for this is, but I've heard things like, because highly transmeditative, trans-channeling types of mystical practices, because they were practiced by, I guess, females in the past, or because they associate females as being very spiritual people, that when someone who comes in of the LGBTQ community is born, they tend to have more effeminate attributes, which people identify as spiritual. And so that's why there tends to be like, oh, that person must be, there's a calling for that person, or they're special in some kind of way. That was something I heard, I don't know, 11 years ago. I can't even remember where I read that from. But there's so much mystery around that, you know, and I think it's something that needs to be explored, and hopefully we'll get down that path soon, you know?
I mean, hopefully future generations of, you know, like traditional shamans even will explore that, because it is happening more frequently. It is happening frequently that, you know, people who are initiated in these ancient traditions are identifying as LGBT. It's happening in Mongolia, it's happening in Korea. And so whether, like, this is something that's definitely to explore, and hopefully when we pass away and become shamanic spirits, we'll be a bit more progressive with the next generation of traditional shamans. But basically, it is definitely that is worth exploring and finding out more about. I know that one Mongolian shaman, I don't know if he's, you know, just blowing shit out of his ass, but there's one that tried to make an explanation that said that every person is born with an inner fire, which is true, and it's possible that with, you know, spirit work, or with contact with certain spirits, or even with contacts with, you know, whatever, the fire burns in a different direction. I don't know. It sounds off to me, and that person has made comments which I have considered to be homophobic, so we'll leave it at that. But I've heard this attempt to explain it, which honestly didn't sound right to me.
And that's where we are, right? Now, so to get back what you were talking about with regards to, you know, kind of being called by your spirits, especially like your ancestral shamanic spirits, to say, you have to do this, right? What do you say to Asian Americans who may not have, especially like our younger generations, who may not have that connection to their ancestral spirits like that, or who may have really gotten the assimilation banged into them? You know, how do you help those individuals recognize whether or not they're being called, or recognize whether or not they should pursue, at least if nothing else, being a devotee to these practices?
Right. And a lot of other Asian Americans I've talked to, I often ask them, like, what do you know about your ancestors, but beyond your grandparents? Like, what have
Mm.
do your parents know anything? Have they told you anything? Do your grandparents know anything? Have they told you anything? And oftentimes the answer, unfortunately, is they don't hear. Their parents might not even know, but they're basically just not getting, information about, their own family history. And honestly, for me, it was actually pretty similar. It was for me, luckily, um, when I did find traditional elders and I spoken with them and they did their own divination on me, that they were able to uncover a lot of things from my own ancestry that, my grandparents, they knew like a little bit, but not really much. And just to tell, and what I've always told other Asian Americans is if you can find a traditional elder who's trustworthy, who's well recommended, to essentially to check you out and see what, and have them sort of diagnose you and see what might be going on. Oftentimes, if these people are going through some level of spiritual sickness, or I guess shamanic sickness, in which case things are happening on a spiritual level that's affecting their own physical, mental health, or other things within their life, and doctors are not able to help, so they find a spiritual professional, and a traditional elder will be able to diagnose if in fact this is a shamanic sickness that's supposed to lead to deeper shamanic path, or sometimes frankly it could just be a spiritual sickness in which there is a spiritual attachment that's messing with your life, basically, and then everything in between. So
Wow.
I always tell people, if nothing else, at least find out where their ancestors came, where they used to live, where they came from. And I tell them, especially if they have a last name that's less than common, in which case for me it definitely was. Find out the history behind that last name, and because that will at least get you to
A general region.
exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, one big thing is the language barrier. So a lot of Asian Americans do have a very heavy language barrier that prevents them from finding the resources that they need, because oftentimes it is not in English.
Yeah.
So
You explained that when you were doing like a lot of source material research. You were saying that
yeah.
a lot of it was like, it was just so hard to get through because of that language and because of the density of the material you were getting as well in that language. That's wild.
Yeah, I mean, being able to find traditional elders does really help. And unfortunately, the answer that traditional elders always give is that they basically just come down to, if the karma is right for you, you'll be able to find your way, is basically how they keep saying. And I'm like, okay, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
That's going to let me know what I need to do tomorrow. Thank you.
Right.
But no, it's true. Oh, gosh. I don't know how much you know about espiritismo, but like, the way that you are describing a lot of how you diagnose and how, you can tell whether sickness or whether it's something that's you're being called to, all of that we practice in espiritismo as well. And part of our journey is to help those progress and do that at the same time. But like, it's just amazing that the similarities across the board. And I can see now why this term shamanism was so misappropriated all of these years, because there are a lot of similarities. I mean, without even really realizing it, you guys kind of laid the blueprint of what shamanism is, and like people kind of took those pieces obviously and then said, hey, Cherokee shaman, that's what this is. You have a spirit animal and some spiritual, and like they kind of jump it all together, but there's similarities. Like when you actually go back and look, their medicine men, not shamans, their medicine men still did a lot of the things that the Siberians did, and vice versa. You can find it in Europe. You can find it with the Druids. There's a lot of similarities in terms of diving into the spirit realm, dealing with energies and spaces that you're not familiar with. It could be dangerous, having the calling, having certain ceremonies for sicknesses and whatnot. And it makes you wonder. It's like, why all these terms, why all of these categories, why all of these distinctions? But then I get a chance to sit with someone like you, and you get an opportunity to see the cultural juiciness of it all, and that distinction is important. That tapestry, that uniqueness about your culture that is imbued and infused into that term, that's what makes it so important, and that's why it's important to keep it separated from everything else. I'm just honored. I'm honored to talk to you about this.
Thank you. One thing I'll say is that, I mean, there's a lot of these similarities, because ultimately, when our respective cultures do digging into the spirit world or the unknown, we come across a lot of the same things on a cosmological level. It's just then through our culture and through our region, we interpret them a little bit differently. And through these interpretations, we do come up with specific vocabulary and specific practices. And so the way that we even see things is, we don't consider the spiritualities of other peoples to be wrong, because we acknowledge that other cultures and other traditions work with different spirits that have their own traditions and have their own culture of doing things. The reason why we say that terminology is important, because terminology and words connect to different energies, connect to different spirits, connect to different cultures and mainframes. So if you are we actually say, if you are using the word shaman and it's originally rooted in this one particular culture, you don't know if by using that word you're bringing to something that is maybe from that area that you're not familiar with, because we do consider words are sacred. And if you're using a word from, and this goes into like words from, Latin American or European or African, if you're using any of those words from their culture, their sacred spiritual words, be prepared that you're going to be dealing with things from those cosmologies, from those cultures, and from those from that spiritual mainframe. And if you're not prepared for that, well, then the good luck, basically.
Yes. Say what you mean and mean what you say, okay? Because it's so true. Like, sometimes you hear people give themselves all these different titles, right? Oh, I'm an empath, or I'm a psychic medium, or I'm this and I'm that. But it's like, do you know what that title entails? Like, are you ready to answer to all the responsibilities that come with that title? Because if not, don't call yourself that anymore. Like use a different term,
like even within our own cultures, for those who are not identified to be shamans, if they start calling themselves shamans, we're like, well,
back it up.
It's not that. It's they're like, you're not worried that's because by calling yourself a shaman, you're essentially inviting entities that you're not equipped to deal with. Like, frankly, because you haven't received the teachings, you haven't received the empowerments, you don't have the protection of that shamanic spirit who is constantly with you in case something happens. And that's the thing, like the part of the deal of being a shaman is, because we're chosen by specific spirits, they're constantly with us. They're constant, like everything and anything we do, they're going to be there. And because oftentimes a lot of resources, if anyone digs up Siberian shamans or whatever, they say that shamans are people who are born with an extra soul. And I don't like that phrasing, because they're not born with an extra soul. They're born with their soul, as well as one of their ancestral shamanic spirits' soul within them as well. So
it's like they're always mounted. It's like they're always with this spirit.
Right. They're always like in the background. So it's not so much you're like, oh, you're born with like having one more soul, that because it's not your soul. It's basically it's a spirit that you are born with in addition to your own soul.
Right. Yeah. Which is, again, wild. So you do have a whole chapter on spirits in your book. And we've talked about ancestral, and we've talked about the shamanic spirit that walks with you once you have this calling. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a spirit that we've seen kind of across the board, which again sort of adds to why shamanism is constantly being misappropriated? So, like, for example, the archetypal image for, let's say, a dragon can be found all over the world. Like, it is truly a universal archetypal spirit. We have no evidence that these motherfuckers actually existed, but for some weird reason, every culture like in the world has their form of a dragon in their mythology somewhere. So are there other spirits within shamanistic practices that you may have noticed in your research pop up in like different cultures too?
Oh, I mean, this is another tricky question because things get reinterpreted over time. So you're like, is that the same, like along the same lines? But yes, as you mentioned, like dragons or serpents, which we envision as land spirits, as certain types of land spirits. You know,
or like elementals and stuff.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, Skyfather, Earth Mother is pretty universal. And another thing that is I would say is actually the concept of different cultures have a different interpretation of a hearth spirit or a hearth god or a fire spirit or a kitchen spirit, which I consider to be pretty parallel, because in within our point of view, the concept of what we would call a household fire spirit is essentially it's a spirit that protects the household, it strengthens the household and the bloodline, and also helps provide a direct link to all other higher powers, whether it's ancestors or gods or whatever.
Okay, yeah, we have one of those too. Okay,
yes.
Okay.
And so actually for us, like, we kind of joke that North Asian shamanism is kind of low-key fire worship, because everything we do incorporates fire with incorporates honoring and strengthening the fire, because without that, it's very hard to be connected with other higher powers, because fire provides that link, that portal almost. And so when I look at other cultures, within, East Asia, they have, the kitchen god, for example, that's, some people have heard of. Within even like European pagan practices, there is always some form of a hearth deity that people pray and make offerings to. And that is, if anything, is probably a little bit more relevant than some of the other gods they have in terms of just their day-to-day. And everywhere I go, like even cultures that might not have such a heavy emphasis on fire, they have this concept of a hearth or something that, that the household is centered around, that in a way it's considered sacred, and, in a way kind of, warms and protects the household and brings the family together. So that's so that's actually one big one that I see. Like even in cultures, again, that don't have a heavy fire emphasis, there is that concept of that, family hearth going on. So that's definitely one that I would say. Yeah,
no doubt. So before I ask you the last question, there also is sort of this misunderstanding that I notice as well, that I would love for you to clear up if you can, but this understanding of the role of the shaman. So, you get a lot of these ideas, especially from media and like movies, where the medicine man, or the shaman, if you will, is also a warrior. Like there's no like, it's not like he's cloistered up in this little hut somewhere, but very much part of the community, very active in the community. And if there's a war, he's in there too. Is that true, or does the shaman role vary based on, place to place?
So yes and no. So one thing we'll say about the role of a shaman, the role of a shaman is never separated from a community. It's rather than like being separate from community, we see the shaman being almost in their own circle within the larger circle of a community. So they're still within the community. They might be doing their own thing that's no one else knows about in the community, but they're in the community. We actually say that there is no purpose of shamans without a community to be based around. Otherwise, because the whole purpose is to ensure balance and coexistence within the community, within themselves, with the spirits. Without the community, they say if a shaman does not have a community, he will go insane from
Yep.
from everything that the spirits are bringing into. It needs to, all that energy, all of that power needs to be shared and dispersed amongst the community. Otherwise, the shaman will go mad from everything that's happening. And so there's, within each culture, there's kind of different roles or different types of shamans that kind of fulfill different roles. So there are war spirits, which case there are shamans that do go to war. There's actually a famous story of Tungus Khan. He always had two shamans by his side, and during battles against other large empires, he would be facing an army of 1,000,000 with his 100,000 warriors, but his shamans would call down war spirits, which then would bring down hail and thunderstorm upon the cities, or upon the army that they were fighting. So their army of 100,000 was able to beat an army of 1,000,000. This is a very popular folk story in Mongolia. So there are shamans that are very engaged in sort of intertribal or I guess international politics, serving that roles. But there are also shamans that only serve roles just within the community, sort of mediating things between the community, making sure that the community itself is staying healthy. And there are also different shamans that play all sorts of different roles. There's a type of shamans that there are types of shamans that are specialized in psychopomp work. In case working with the dead. Even though they're specialized in it, they don't like to do it because, again, it is very risky.
It's very risky, yes.
Yeah. So they're specialized. They'd rather not, but they're specialized to do it. And then there's different types of shamans who there's also and unfortunately within some cultures there is the role of a half-trained shaman or shaman who's only completed part of their training, in which case maybe the only thing that they can do is divination, and they don't have the empowerments to do other ceremonies.
That would be the little shaman.
So I do.
Did I get that wrong?
Yes and no. I do want to say the whole big shaman and little shaman is actually specific to one region known as the Amur River Valley, and in that group of tribes, they're actually very open-minded in spiritual practice, and that they believe that every person should be trained to do some level of spiritual and even shamanic work. But the big shaman is essentially the true shaman that is trained fully as a shaman. Yeah. And they were pretty much referred to anyone who does light spiritual and shamanic work for themselves or for their families to be a little shaman. Now, in their cultures, every child is trained to how to drum and how to dance, so that's when in their development they have at least the ability to do what we can maybe call like shamanic first aid for themselves and for their families. It's if they need anything more.
Dude, that's dope. We need to incorporate that into our culture. Like, that is so dope because it's true. At least I believe that everyone does come into this earth with like a little something, a little intuition, a little gut feeling, a little something. And I think it should be nourished, and everyone should have that ability and have a little something to take care of their own little family for, like not everyone needs to be a professional tarot reader or needs to be a professional, healer and this and that. But like, if you can learn a little bit just for you and your family, that's so beautiful and helpful. Heck yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, of course they have a very set system for that. Like people who are little shamans, they can only perform for themselves and their families. They have a whole structure where they're not allowed to perform for people outside their family because that
would be dangerous.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my God. This is so fascinating, and I have a million more questions. Do you mind wanting to come back?
I'd be happy to come back, but
oh my gosh.
But one last thing I will mention is I think you kind of touched on this in terms of how someone is chosen to be a shaman, and one thing I'll say, it is a cycle. So we say that our shamanic ancestral spirits, we say it that way because those spirits were shamans when they were living, and when they passed away, they became that shamanic ancestral spirit for the next generation of shamans. And then when that next generation passes away, they have to be that shamanic spirit that then chooses the next shaman within their own lineage. So it's a cycle that repeats. And it's almost always ancestral spirits. On occasion, it is a land spirit, but that happens because that land spirit was somehow bound to that family bloodline. So in a way, it is still ancestral because it is bound to that bloodline. But essentially, that's how it happens. So it's 99% of the time, it's you come from a family that did have a shaman somewhere in the past, 8 or 9 generations.
Right. Yeah, we have something very similar to that. In Catholic tradition, it's, there's a saint, there's a family saint that always gets passed down. And in the Taino traditions, there's usually a family semi that will get, honored all the way down. That's just, man. So let me ask you one last thing.
Sure.
Aside from, actually, you know what? Why don't you tell us, what are you up to? Where can people find you? What's coming up next for you? Do you have any classes? Like, what's going on with you?
The vast majority of what I'm doing these days is appearing on podcasts, live radio shows like this. I am going to be appearing at the Witches Fest USA festival in New York City.
Me too! Yay!
Yeah. Yeah. I wish I had more on the conference circuit that I have planned, but that's pretty much all I have planned right now. I'm talking to a couple bookstores on potentially doing events. I don't have plans to travel to other places, but I would love to. I'm open to it, so I would love to travel around to other bookstores that are willing to do events. People can follow me, again, on Instagram, David J. Shi 311. I am on Facebook, but I don't post that much on there anymore, so most of the content is going to be on Instagram. And yeah, I don't really have any plans on any further writing projects because right now I'm trying to focus on promoting this one.
For sure. And honestly, like, even with this one, there was so much stuff in there that I was like, he could write a whole nother book just on this particular thing because this is really cool. So listen, again, to the audience, please get your hand on this book. The link to purchase it on Amazon is down in the description below, or you can get it right on the website. I mean, like, it is just too much. Now, before we say goodbye and before I give you my thanks and my honor, are there any last words that you want to give to the audience, to the people watching, to other Asian Americans, to other shamans that you may know? Like, what are some last words you want to give us?
Well, the one thing that I just want to talk to sort of all people about, which that's kind of directly specific to this book, is that the way that the one thing we consider our practices to be very practical. And the reason is because for much of North Asian cultures, a lot of them were nomads, and even those who weren't, they had to live in a very practical sense. So even though there are ceremonies that are culture specific, we consider our practices to be practical, to be relatable to people from all other traditions and spiritual backgrounds. So definitely people who are of Asian descent or Asian Americans, even though it might not be talking about East Asian or Southeast Asian specifically, there's going to be a lot of similar concepts that for people who want to explore that a little bit more. And for people who have no Asian background whatsoever, again, we consider these to be practical concepts that can be universally applied to the extent that we consider, like, for example, it's always good to take your vitamins, right? So the practices that I do talk about in the book are essentially practices that, like, we would consider would be good for everyone to practice. So the practices that I include, the information that I include, is pretty much open knowledge. It's open concepts that people can use to enhance their own practices, and it shouldn't interfere with any practices that people already are incorporating, or at least it can help inspire some additions to or enhancements to what people are already doing. So from that standpoint, the way that I would see our practices is that I think everyone can find something that is useful out of it. Everyone can find something that will enhance their own practice and might even help them discover a little bit more about, their own ancestry or their own spiritual heritage.
Yes. And I know I have with this book. So, and I'm going to read it again just because now that we've spoken about it and you were able to clear up a few things, I'm going to look at it completely different now. So I'm really excited for the reread. And once again, thank you so much for coming on. Truly an honor to speak to you. Thank you all who watched us live tonight. And to those who will be watching on the replay, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. And once again, remember, this is how we grow, you guys. This stuff right here, these conversations, these books. All right, this is how we grow. So make it happen. All right, everybody. Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.